Welcome back to the Stone Date Podcast. I'm Wes, and today we'll be talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this is part 2 of our Lewis and Clark series. I did have a disclaimer in the first episode, and we'll have a link below if you need to catch up. And I believe we left the Corps last. They were working their asses off trying to make it to the Pacific. Basically, they had just left for their journey. They had just barely kind of gotten into it. Not too much setup for this one, but I did want to burn before, so let's do that. Today, I'm going to be smoking a pretty classic strain. It's called Jack Herer, and the brand is Abundant Organics. Again, this is a house brand of True Leaf, my local dispensary. And the grow that I have is a pretty good one. It's 27.65%. And from what I found online, I'm just going to go to Leafly for the description of this. It says Jack Herer, also known as JH, the Jack, Premium Jack, and Platinum Jack, is a sativa-dominant marijuana strain that has gained as much renown as its namesake, combining a haze hybrid with a Northern Lights No. 5 and Shiva Skunk Cross. Cincy Seeds created Jack Herer, hoping to capture both cerebral elevation and heavy resin production. Its rich genetic background gives rise of several different variations of Jack Herer, each phenotype bearing its own unique features and effects. Leafly reviewers tell us that Jack Herer's effects include energetic, creative, and uplifted. However, consumers typically describe it a 55% sativa hybrid as blissful, clear-headed, and creative. Jack Herer was created in the Netherlands in the mid-1990s, was later distributed by Dutch pharmacies as a recognized medical-grade strain. Since then, this spicy pine-scented strain has taken home numerous awards for its quality and potency. And yeah, it has it on the meter. It has it pretty much all the way energized, and the THC level on this is just on Leafly, has got it just barely past halfway. But like I said, the one that I have is 27.65%, and yeah, nothing special about this. It's not, what am I trying to say here? It's not infused or any of that stuff. It's just some good bud. And that's what we're going to be smoking today. If you want to leave me a comment or send an email, let me know what you're smoking when you're listening to the show. Definitely taste some pine in that. I don't know. I almost felt like it was a gassy flavor, almost like the sour D that I had the other night. Actually, that was several nights ago. Okay, July 4th. July 4th, the men pulled ashore at the mouth of the creek, some 15 yards wide, and they named it Independence Creek. They stopped for the night at a site at an old Kansas Indian town and distributed an extra gill for the men. At sunset, they fired the cannon, and this was the first 4th of July celebration west of the Mississippi River. On July 8th, there was a minor Indian scare, but nothing came of it. On the night of July 11th, Private Alexander Willard went to sleep on his post, and he was later tried and sentenced to 100 lashes each day for 4 days. On July 21st, the party reached the mouth of the Platte River. 640 miles, the expedition had not seen one native. Per Jefferson's main objectives for the native tribes, Lewis was to establish American sovereignty, peace, and a trading empire in which the warriors could put down their weapons and take on traps. The previous year, Lewis had purchased beads, brass buttons, tomahawks, axes, scissors, mirrors, tobacco, vermilion face paint, and whiskey while he was in Philadelphia and St. Louis as gifts for the tribes. Rifles, balls, and powder were the most desired items, and Lewis wanted to demonstrate what his men could do with the Kentucky long rifle, but he was not able to provide the natives with weapons due to the limited amount of space, and honestly, they just didn't want to arm the natives. On August 2nd, 1804, a party of Odos in the few Missouri arrived at camp accompanied by a French trader and translator. The captains gave the natives some tobacco and some pork, flour, and meal, and in return the Indians gave them some watermelons. And the next morning, the expedition had its first meeting with the natives. It took Lewis nearly a half hour to deliver his speech and have it translated. He opened by advising the warriors to be wise and look to the true interests of their people. Lewis informed them that the Missouri River country now belonged to the United States, and everyone was bound to obey the commands of their great chief and president, who is now their only great father. And then came some threats, like the Great Father could stop all trade from coming up the river if they displeased him. Without European trade, the Odos would suffer a severe setback in their living conditions and would be more vulnerable to hostile neighbors who had access to guns and powder. When Lewis concluded, the captains distributed presents. The Odos acknowledged that they had heard what Lewis had said, promised to follow his good advice, and they were happy that their new father could be depended on. I'm not sure how dependable. They then requested some powder and whiskey, and Lewis met the request, providing a canister of powder, 50 balls, and a bottle of whiskey. He also shut off his air gun. Yes, they had an air gun. A 46 caliber Girondini air rifle, to be more specific, that the party had brought along with them. It had been designed for the Austrian army and was deadly, but it took around 1,500 fucking pumps to fill this thing, and that was enough for 30 shots. I'm not sure if 30 would be deadly, all 30 of them, but could you imagine just being in war or something, having to pump this thing 1,500 times? So I guess 750 times would get you 15 shots. I don't know if it translated like that. But the Indians departed as the expedition proceeded on. And that night, Private Moses B. Reed told the captains that he had left his knife back at the council site, and they gave him permission to retrieve it. 3 days later, he had not returned. The captains believed he had deserted, and they selected Drouillard. And by the way, he is French. There's 2 L's in the middle of his name. I'm not sure. I could be butchering that last name. That's how I've heard it said. But Drouillard, along with 3 other men, went to seek and find Reed. Drouillard was gone 10 days, and by August 17th, he brought back Reed along with a delegation of chiefs from the Odos, including Little Thief and Big Horse. The court-martial was formed. Reed was sentenced to run the gauntlet 4 times through the party, and each man with 9 switches should punish him. And that amounted to about 500 lashes. In addition, Reed was discharged from the permanent party. He had given up his rifle and the privilege of standing guard and would be sent back to St. Louis in the spring. And that evening, to celebrate Captain Lewis's 30th birthday, an extra dram of whiskey per man went around, and the fiddle came out, and the men danced around the campfire till nearly midnight. The next morning, Clark was astonished when Big Horse showed up naked to emphasize his poverty. And they gave him some tobacco, paint, and beads. And these gifts obviously made little impressions on the chiefs and warriors. And how was this supposed to help? I know you're doing bad here, chap, but here, I have something for you. What do I have? Here, you can paint your dick, throw some beads on it there, and smoke some tobacco. It was more like a spit in the face than a helpful gift, I guess. And they probably looked at each other afterwards. What's wrong, Clark? They don't like the paint? They don't like the beads? Did you give them the tobacco? Did you give them that? These guys just didn't get it. Anyway, the captains gave the chiefs and warriors a dram of whiskey each and brought out their magic show. This included an air gun, a magnifying glass, a telescope, and some other items. But the Odos had not come to be awed. They had come for goods, and with that they went away unhappy. Still, Little Thief indicated that he would go to Washington in the spring, so the captain's first venture as frontier diplomats had some success. Things might be very different with the Sioux. On August 20th, Sergeant Charles Floyd died, most likely from peritonitis resulting from an infected appendix that had perforated or ruptured, and he had been ill the past few days, and Lewis found nothing effective to treat it. Sergeant Floyd was the first U.S. soldier to die west of the Mississippi and the only man to die on this expedition. And that's pretty wild. I think at the end of it, I'll have the numbers later, but I think at the end of it, there ended up being like 40 or 45 total guys. Like the main party was, I believe, around 33. But the captains had buried him with all the honors of war and fixed a red cedar post over his grave with his name, title, and the date. They also named the river they were on Floyd's River and the bluff Sergeant Floyd's Bluff. August 26th through the 27th, Private George Shannon, the youngest member of the party, never returned from a hunt. The captains grew concerned and sent out John Coulter to look for him, but he had no luck. They then sent out Drouillard, but he too reported failure. The 27th, the party approached today's Yankton, South Dakota. They were now in the territory of the Yankton Sioux. Lewis ordered the prairie set afire as a signal to the Yanktons, inviting them to council. And a few hours later, a teenage Yankton boy swam out to one of the pirogues. The expedition pulled ashore, and 2 more teenagers appeared. Through Mr. Dorian, they said a large camp of Yanktons were camped nearby. The captains delegated Sergeant Pryor and Mr. Dorian to go to the camp and invite the chiefs to come to council at Calumet Bluffs near present-day Gavin's Point Dam on the Nebraska side. August 29th, the Corps was in camp at Calumet's Bluff, At 4 p.m., Mr. Dorian showed up on the opposite bank at the head of the party of some 70 Yankton warriors. By 10 a.m., the captain sent a canoe to bring them over. With Dorian interpreting, Lewis gave what he called his basic Indian speech, and when he finished, the chief said that they would respond in the morning. Afterwards, the Indian boys showed off their skills with bows and arrows. At dusk, they built 3 fires in the center of the camp and danced to music from deer hoof rattles and a drum. In the morning, the chiefs gave their reply. They needed powder, ball, and whiskey. But the captains weren't able to meet those needs. They were able to leave Dorian for the winter. He could arrange peace with other tribes and organize an expedition to Washington in the spring. They gave the chiefs some tobacco and Dorian a bottle of whiskey. Despite the Yanktons' disappointment with the presents, the first encounter with the Sioux ended in a hopeful one. By mid-September, the expedition had reached the short grass prairie of the drier high plains, just east of the Rockies, and there were herds of elk, deer were plentiful, as were the birds. Buffalo became a common sight as well. The men pointed out a goat in which no one could identify, and Clark recorded that plums were, quote, most delicious that he had ever tasted, and the grapes were plentiful and finely flavored. Earlier on September 3rd, John Coulter went to find Shannon again. When the men had to move the killboat upriver, this took a tremendous effort. They had ropes, tow ropes, that they literally had to drag the boat sometimes. And because of the amount of effort, each man consumed up to 9 pounds of meat a day. And this was extremely lean meat compared to beef, along with whatever fruits in the area afforded and some cornmeal. And with all this, they were still hungry. September 7th, 1804, they walked into a small village of prairie dogs. This animal was new to science. The captains gave the animal its first formal description and eventually caught one and sent it back to Jefferson. And I believe it was John Coulter when they were there. He just really needed to use the bathroom, and he coined the phrase prairie dogging it. September 11th, as the Corps spotted Shannon sitting on the riverbank, he was extremely weak and near starving. As he ate some jerky meat, he told his story. This fucking poor guy. He was sure the boat was ahead, so he'd been chasing it for 16 fucking days, and he ran out of bullets after 4 days. He had managed to kill one rabbit by stabbing it with a stick, and other than that, he lived off of grapes and plums for 2 weeks. I'm sure when he got back, he was shooting a plum wonderfall. He decided to sit on the riverbank and wait on a trading boat coming from the Mandan villages towards St. Louis, and he had his horse as one last resort. 3 days later, on the 14th, Clark killed a goat. Now, the entire time, whenever they had the opportunity, Clark and Lewis were recording all this information about all the plants, animal life, pretty much everything, and every way they could to describe what was around them and what they were seeing. Over the next week, the expedition sped ahead, making 23 miles, then 25, then 33 in one day. They finally shot a coyote and added a mule deer to their list. Sunday, September 23rd, they made 20 miles and made camp. As they prepared camp, 3 teenage Teton Sioux swam across. With Drouillard exchanging messages via sign, they said they were a band of 80 lodges camped at the mouth of the next river, and a second band of 60 lodges a short distance from the first. The captains gave him some tobacco and told them to inform their chiefs that the expedition would come tomorrow for council. The next morning, they proceeded upriver and ran into Coulter. He ran up to them shouting that an Indian had stolen his horse. Through Drouillard's sign and using Pierre Creuset to translate, they told the Indians that they had come in peace but were not afraid to fight. They said the horse was sent by their new father and would not speak to any Tetons until the horse was returned. The spot where this meeting took place is in present-day Pierre, South Dakota. The captains raised the flagstaff, set up the awning, and prepared for council. By 11 a.m., 3 chiefs and many warriors came bearing large quantities of buffalo meat as a gift, and captains offered them pork. Then it was time to talk. I feel like the captains made out there. I would rather have the buffalo meat. I do believe when we say buffalo, from what I was able to find, I don't know if there was an American buffalo. I think we're talking about American bison here. They just called them buffalo. So we still have bison today. And I would definitely go for bison meat over pork, but maybe because I've had more pork. Unfortunately, they quickly discovered that Creuset could not speak enough of the language to properly translate, and recognizing this, Lewis cut the speech short and began with their magic show. And finally, he handed out medals and gifts. He designated Black Buffalo as the leading chief and gave him a medal and two other small gifts, a red military coat and a cocked hat. The other two chiefs, Partisan and Buffalo Medicine, got medals. The captains felt sure that they had completed their part, but soon realized that there was some discontent amongst the chiefs, so they invited them on their killboat, and things got a little weird after some whiskey. They had to force the natives off the boat into a canoe. When it landed, 3 warriors seized the bowline, another hugged the mast. Partisan pretended to be drunk and staggered up, declaring the gifts weren't sufficient to proceed upriver. He then demanded a canoe full of presents. Clark then drew his sword and ordered all hands under arms. On the killboat, Lewis ordered the men to prepare for action. The swivel gun was loaded with 16 musket balls. The blunderbusses were loaded with buckshot. The men loaded their rifles and prepared to fire. Some warriors saw this and backed away, but others strung up their bows and took out arrows from their quivers and began to cock their shotguns. It was a dramatic moment. If the cannon had fired, there may not have been a Lewis and Clark expedition. Luckily for them, Black Buffalo seized the bowline from the warriors and motioned to the warriors hugging the mast to go ashore. Partisan soon joined them. After Clark made some threats through draw your sign and Cosette's simple words, I feel like that's funny, they're talking shit through sign. I think I know the sign for that. 3 chiefs went into conference. Clark finally managed to quiet his emotions. He walked over to the chiefs and offered his hands. The chiefs refused to take it. Clark then turned and ordered his men to join him and waded out to their pirogue. Black Buffalo and 2 warriors waited after him and asked to sleep aboard the boat. Clark nodded his consent. So in short, the first meeting with the Teton Sioux and the Americans had gone badly. The following morning, at Black Buffalo's request, the expedition anchored near his village. The captains invited some men, women, and children to come on board, and Black Buffalo invited Lewis to come to his village. Black Buffalo insisted on showing Lewis the greatest courtesies, including repeat invitations to take a squaw. Lewis remained for another night or so they could show their good disposition towards us. At dusk, Lewis and Clark were carried with much ceremony on a decorated buffalo robe to the great council lodge in the middle of the village. Fires glowed as women prepared a feast. Slabs of buffalo meat toasted over hot coals. Inside the council lodge, 70 elders sat in a circle. The Americans sat next to Black Buffalo and smoked pipes with the group. Afterwards, Lewis asked Black Buffalo to make peace with the Omahas, and surely Black Buffalo thought he was mad. Why would he make peace with the enemy for the white man? Then his people had a scalp dance displaying those recently acquired from the Omahas, and it was the first Sioux scalp dance the Americans had ever seen. The dance broke up at midnight, and then Black Buffalo offered the captains young women as bed partners, but the captains refused. In the morning, as the men were trying to leave, a group of well-armed warriors approached. Black Buffalo came aboard and asked them to stay one more day. And then several warriors grabbed the bowline. Black Buffalo said the warriors just wanted some tobacco. Lewis said he would not be forced into anything, but finally threw some to Black Buffalo before being able to depart. And I believe what he was throwing back wasn't like bags of tobacco. It was almost like their form of a cigarette. I forget exactly what they called it. I didn't write it down, but it wasn't really important to the narrative. With that, the Teton confrontation was over. On October 20th, in present-day Fort Lincoln State Park, North Dakota, Private Crozet was the first to encounter a grizzly bear. They had heard about the grizzlies from the natives, and they knew they rarely fucked with them, and when they did, they dressed for war. Clark had seen a footprint from a grizzly earlier, and the expedition was eager to find one. These fucking idiots. Crozet was lucky. Lewis wrote, "He wounded him, but being alarmed at the formidable appearance of the bear, he left his tomahawk and gun." Crozet returned later for his items. Beginning in October, as the Corps made its way through present northern South Dakota, it passed numerous abandoned villages. These had once been home to the Arikara tribe. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the Arikara tribe was in the movie The Revenant. They were the tribe kind of chasing after Leonardo DiCaprio's Hugh Glass character, and they were the tribe, I think they were the same tribe that scalped Tom Hardy at the end of it. I'm not 100%, but I think they were just the tribe you'd see throughout the movie. About 30,000 strong they were in the year the U.S. won its independence. Then they had been reduced by a smallpox epidemic. By the late 1780s, there was only 6,000 left, about that number. What had been 18 villages had been reduced to 3. October 8th, the killboat passed a 3-mile-long island, home of the 3 Arikara villages, and some 2,000 natives lined the bank, watching the boat progress to the head of the island and then watch the men make camp. Lewis elected 2 voyagers who spoke the Arikara language and 2 soldiers, then paddled across in a pirogue to meet the natives. Clark stayed in camp and prepared for both peace or war. Lewis did not know what kind of reception he would receive. From what he knew or what he thought he knew, the Arikaras were farmers oppressed by the Sioux, and this was not true. They had traded mutually with the Sioux. He knew the Arikaras were at war with the Mandans. In Lewis's view, if the Arikaras could be broken away from the Sioux, and if they made peace with the Mandans, the whole balance of power would shift. The Sioux would be isolated and excluded from the U.S. trade empire. He received a warm welcome from the Arikaras. He met Joseph Gravelines, a trader who had been living with the Arikaras for 13 years. He was an invaluable source of information for the upper Missouri country, and he was able to communicate accurately with the Arikara. A large part of the problem with the Sioux was the lack of adequate and complete translation. The next morning, Clark was astonished to see bull boats brought to the bank. These were boats made of a single buffalo hide stretched over a bowl-shaped willow frame. They brought with them some chiefs, some warriors, and Pierre-Antoine Tableau, a trader from another of the island villages. Tableau was a fur trader from Montreal and educated from Quebec. He lived in Illinois, then Missouri, and then with the Arikara. He too was an outstanding translator. The council was put off until the following day due to difficulties with wind just whipping up sand and making a roar. The following morning, October 10th, Tableau came over first. After smoking and exchanging small presents, Lewis stood and began his basic Indian speech with Gravelines interpreting. Accept American sovereignty, make peace with the Mandans, shun the Sioux, and trade with the American merchants is basically what he was trying to convey. If they did as told, they would be protected by their new father. When Lewis finished, the detail fired 3 shots from the bow swivel gun. Then the captains brought out some more gifts. There was vermilion paint, pewter-looking glasses, 400 needles, how the fuck would they know that? Broadcloth, beads, combs, razors, 9 pairs of scissors, and again, who the fuck wrote this down? No, are you sure we're not going to give them 10 pairs? No, sir. We talked about this earlier before we left. Do you not know, John? 9 pairs. We're giving 3 pairs for every 500 people. Did we not decide this? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Knives, tomahawks, and more. No whiskey, though. The captains offered it, but the Arikaras said no. They actually shamed Lewis and Clark by remarking they were surprised that their father should present them with liquor, which would make them act like fools. Despite Tableau's warning, the captains made Crow at Rest the first chief, on the assumption that every tribe had a single leader, and made Hawk's father and Chief Hay second chiefs to the other villages. For the chiefs, there were military coats, cocked hats, medals, and American flags. After presents, they shot off their air gun. The council broke up, and the chiefs promised to consult their warriors and respond in the morning. That afternoon, the men visited the villages. York was a sensation. The Arikaras had never seen a black man. York played with the children. The soldiers, meanwhile, enjoyed some favors from the Arikara women, often encouraged to do so by their husbands, who believed that they would catch some power of the white man from their sexual intercourse transmitted to them from their wives. One warrior invited York to his lodge and offered him to his wife and even guarded the entrance during the act. York was said to be big medicine. Whether secret powers could be had from such intercourse doesn't seem to be true, but what was exchanged from their hospitality was venereal diseases, which was rampant in the villages and passed on to the men of the expedition. October 11th, Crow at Rest returned to make his answer to the captain's proposals. He said his heart was glad to have a new father, that the road was open to the expedition and would always be open. He also asked the captains to make peace between his people and the Mandans. One of the chiefs agreed to go on board and make the trip to the Mandans to talk in council sponsored by the Americans. On the 13th, Clark and Lewis were confronted with a severe disciplinary action. Former Private Moses Reed, the deserter, was a grousing, malcontented soldier who wanted to poison the mind of at least one member of the expedition, Private John Newman. He agitated him about a specific captain, I don't know which one exactly, and how unfair they were. And Newman succumbed to the poison and lashed out at the captain, who had him and Reed arrested. In court, Newman was sentenced to 75 lashes on his bare back and be discarded from the permanent party. The sentence was ordered the next day, and they further ordered Newman to join the Frenchmen in the canoes as a laboring hand. Reed would be banished and then sent back the following spring. October 24th, the expedition was well north of present-day Bismarck and approaching the Mandan villages. The captains knew the Mandans were the center of northern plains trade, attracting Indians from vast distances. At trading times in the late summer, the river villages were crowded with Crows, Cheyennes, Kiowas, Arapahoes, along with whites from the Northern West Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and the St. Louis businessmen. Nowhere else could one see a single glance of diversity and colorful lifestyles of the natives of the plains. There were two Mandan villages, the lower one led by Big White and his second chief, Little Raven, and further upriver was a second village led by Black Cat, with Raven Man Chief as his second in command. On the Knife River, there were three Hidatsa villages. One of these led by Black Moccasin, another led by Laborne, possibly, Borgne. I'm not sure how to say that, but I think it means one eye. A military chieftain of great reputation. That's who Laborne was. The Mandans hunted buffalo on horseback, but they did not ride out on war parties ranging to the Rocky Mountains as the Hidatsa did. As they moved north, the expedition began seeing abandoned Mandan villages that had been decimated by smallpox. I'm going to have to get some water. All right. Jack Harrer got that cotton mouth going. With Gravelines translating, Lewis introduced Big White to their Arikara chief. They smoked a pipe, and then the captains, Gravelines, and their Arikara chief accompanied Big White to his village. Peace between the two tribes seemed possible. October 26, Lewis and Gravelines walked to the village while Clark stayed on the boat. Lewis received a warm welcome. Meanwhile, a trader from the second Mandan village named Rene Jassam paid a visit to Clark. Jassam had been living with the Mandans for 15 years and participated fully in their ceremonial and social lives. He had married a Mandan woman and was raising a family in the village. Clark ended up hiring him, as he would be a useful interpreter and a source of information. Relations with the Mandans continued to be excellent. The expedition would spend the next 5 months as their neighbors. On October 29th, the first formal council was held. Lewis gave his basic Indian speech. When he finished, Clark introduced the Arikara chief, who smoked with the Mandans. On the last day of October, Black Cat invited Clark to his lodge to hear what he had to say. He said when they had heard the Corps was coming, they were expecting great presents. They were very disappointed and dissatisfied. Not so much himself, but his village was. Still, he would go meet their great father in Washington in the spring. The captain's quarters for the winter was in Fort Mandan, which is located on the north bank of the Missouri, some 7 miles below the mouth of the Knife and directly opposite the lower Mandan village. Work on it began November 3rd. November 4th, 1804, Clark recorded he had been visited by a Frenchman by the name of Charbonneau, Toussaint Charbonneau. He was a French-Canadian, about 45 years old. He once worked for the Northwest Company, but now he was living with the Hidatsa as an independent trader. His squaws, or wives, were Shoshone, from a band that lived in the Rocky Mountains at the headwater of the Missouri. They were teenagers who had been captured by a Hidatsa raiding party 4 years earlier. Charbonneau had won them in a bet, I believe, with warriors who had captured them. I don't know what the fuck he was betting to win 2 women, but who the fuck knows. The captains eagerly accepted Charbonneau's offer to sign on as an interpreter, not so much for himself, but because his wives could speak the language of the mountain tribes. The wives could speak Hidatsa to Charbonneau, who could speak French to Drouillard, who could pass it on to the captains in English. So on the spot, they signed up Charbonneau and one of his wives, and he chose his 6-month pregnant wife, Sacagawea. So just a second, let's stop and talk about this young lady's name. I chose to go with Sacagawea because that's what I'm comfortable with. I grew up down south, and that's how I've always said her name. I believe that nowadays it's most widely accepted as Sacagawea, like a hard G, but the Shoshone, where the young lady's thought to be from originally, they still pronounce her name Sacagawea today. So mainly for my own comfort, I will continue with this pronunciation, and I mean no disrespect, and no matter what I call her, I do believe the Corps could not have completed their task without her assistance. She went above and beyond her translating job. On December 7th, a Mandan chief came to the fort to report that there were great numbers of buffalo on the hills, a couple of miles or so from the river. The chief offered horses for the soldiers. Lewis then gathered a party of 15 men, and with the borrowed horses went out to join the hunt. Using rifles, Lewis and his men killed 11 buffalo that day. They enjoyed it so much he stayed out all night, apparently sleeping in a buffalo robe in below-zero weather. And a buffalo robe was a cured hair-on bison hide used by the Native Americans for warmth as blankets and sometimes clothes. The next day, the Americans killed 9 more buffalo. They ate only the tongues. The wolves got the rest. That day, the temperature was down to 45 below zero. This was the coldest it would get all winter, but the winter hadn't even started yet. It was about 13 days away. The winter in Fort Mandan was cold AF, with the average being about 4 degrees above zero in December. The river was frozen, solid enough so herds of buffalo could cross without breaking the ice. Lewis wanted to pull the killboat on shore for repairs, but it was locked in ice, and not until February 26 were they able to get it out of the water. The garrison at Fort Mandan maintained regular military security with drills, sentry posting, challenges, and daily inspections of the weapons. There were no fights or desertions. The Sioux did end up making a raid in mid-February. Clark had gone hunting and killed more meat than he could transport. Clark dispatched Druyer with 3 other men when he returned to Fort Mandan, and a band of 6 warriors spied the small party. The natives got away with 2 slaves and 2 knives. However, they were forced to give back a tomahawk and 1 horse sleigh. This was about 105 native warriors to 4 white men, so the Americans did not do too badly in that. February 15th, 1805, Lewis had led a party of 24 men to punish the Sioux and Arikara for attacking the Mandans. A few Mandan warriors came along as allies, but the weather was bad and the snow was deep, and the men soon had their feet cut and bleeding on the sharp ice. Lewis abandoned the search, but kept going for 30 miles before he discovered 2 abandoned teepees. Thoroughly exhausted, yeah, I bet, the party slept there. And the next day, Lewis instead went hunting, and they were out to basically a war party trying to fight with the tribe, and then he's just like, has that shitty night, sleeps in a teepee. He's like, you know what, yeah, fuck the Sioux. Let's just go hunting, guys. So anyway, they go hunting. The party stayed out for a week and brought back more than a ton of meat, 36 deer and 14 elk. And I guess they needed the meat, but it's just kind of a weird string of events. I mean, it's almost like they had a plan, but at times they just really did whatever the fuck they wanted. The men got along fine with the Mandans. The chiefs and captains, warriors, and men called on one another, went hunting together, traded extensively, enjoyed sexual relations with the same women on a regular basis. They joked and talked about what they knew. The Mandans and Hidatsas shared their knowledge about the West Country. On New Year's Day, 1805, half the detachment went to the lower Mandan village, at the request of the chief, to dance to the music of a tambourine, a sounding horn, and Private Crisette's fiddle. From January 3rd to the 5th, the Mandans held a nightly dance of their own, and this gets pretty wild here. When the men arrived, they were ushered to the back of a communal earth lodge. The dance began. To the music of rattles and drums, old men of the village sat in a circle waiting. Soon the young men and their wives filled in to take their place at the back of the circle, and they had a smoking ceremony for the old guys. As the drumbeat became more insistent and the chanting swelled, one of the young men would approach an old man and beg him to take his wife, who in turn would appear naked before the elder, and she would lead him by the hand to a place for the business. In the event that the old man failed to gratify his wife, the husband will offer her again and again, and throw a robe into the bargain if need be. And all this, Clark noted, is to cause the buffalo to come near, so they could kill them. And the buffalo dance was thought to be a magnet for the wandering herds. There was a second purpose of the dance. The Mandans also believed that power could be transferred from one man to another through sexual relations with the same woman. The Mandans contributed to the whites' great powers and big medicine. So throughout the 3-day buffalo dance, the Americans were said to be untiringly zealous in attracting the cow and in transferring power. Lewis had also been doing a great deal of doctoring there. On the first day of winter, a Mandan woman brought her child to Lewis and showed him an abscess on the child's back and offered Lewis as much corn as she could carry for some medicine to cure the sore, and Lewis complied. On January 10th, a 13-year-old Mandan boy came to the fort with frozen feet. The captains used a standard treatment, soaking the feet in cold water, and it worked for his men, but for this boy he was too far gone. On January 26, Clark recorded that Captain Lewis took off the toes of one foot of the boy who got frostbit some time ago. 5 days later, the captains sawed off the boy's toes from the other foot. Just a note that a surgical saw was not listed in the medical kit, but 2 hand saws were, and that's a gory visual. Aside from the frozen skin and extremities, the most common medical problem was syphilis. It's possible that nearly every man suffered from the disease, and these guys were just burning and dripping and itching all over the place. As for the captains, they never mentioned taking the standard treatment themselves. At the time, they also didn't know how dangerous mercury was, and Lewis administered it routinely to his men. And that's where we're going to leave the party today, just after New Year's 1805. They made it a great distance, but we have a lot more to cover and will in part 3 of the Lewis and Clark series. In the next episode, we get to have a baby. But hey, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say or a good subject to explore, leave a comment or send an email to stonedatepod@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook at the Stone Date Podcast with Wes Ranson. And if you prefer YouTube, we're at youtube.com/@stonedatepod. We'll have links for these down below and a link to our Patreon. We have 2 tiers at the moment. We have a $3 Ape supporter and a $5 Stone Date Face tier with early release of all episodes. That's for the $5 tier there. If you could help support the show, it would be greatly appreciated. I'd like to grow this into something, but if not, I'll keep doing it as long as I'm able. Thanks again, and have a chill day.